1943, Fort Robinson, Nebraska. The truck doors slammed shut behind them. Dozens of captured German soldiers stood blinking under the vast Midwestern sky. No ruins, no guards shouting in rage, only wind hissing through prairie grass and the clatter of metal trays from a nearby kitchen. The smell reached them first, fresh bread. It hung in the cold air with an almost insulting comfort. They hesitated, chained expectations colliding with the reality of steam rising from a mess hall chimney. Inside the low wooden building, American cooks in aprons ladled stew into enamel bowls, the same beef and potatoes scheduled for U.S. troops that night. Cups of hot coffee waited beside baskets of fruit. The prisoners, gaunt from months of campaigning in North Africa, watched in disbelief as the guards motioned them forward and removed their hand restraints. A corporal translated the orders. Eat. No speeches, no threats, just utensils scraping softly against plates. Some stared before tasting. Others wept quietly behind tin mugs as warmth returned to their limbs. For men long taught that capture meant humiliation and starvation, this felt like fiction. What they didn't yet know was that it was deliberate policy, an American experiment in morality, precision, and quiet power expressed through food, and across an anxious nation still rationing sugar and meat. People would soon ask the same question. Why were we feeding the enemy so well? When the Second World War expanded beyond Europe, millions of soldiers soon belonged to no country. Between 1940 and 1945, more than 26 million combatants were captured worldwide, nearly half of them Axis personnel. Nowhere was the paradox of custody more visible than in the United States. By the summer of 1943, as Allied victory crept closer, ships began arriving from North Africa not with reinforcements, but with prisoners. The first Germans stepped onto the docks at Norfolk, Virginia, wearing sun-bleached uniforms of Rommel's Africa Corps. Behind them came Italians from Sicily and, later, small numbers of Japanese taken in the Pacific. By war's peak, over 430,000 enemy POWs would be housed across 45 states, behind fences, yet inside the beating heart of American abundance. The decision to bring them to U.S. soil was both logistical and moral. Crowded British camps neared collapse. Liberty ships returning empty from combat zones needed ballast, and Washington believed that distance equaled security. But a deeper motive existed. The United States had signed the 1929 Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War, committing itself to humane standards even under total war. Each belligerent had promised adequate food, shelter, and medical care. Neglect was prohibited, retaliation outlawed. When word reached Berlin and Tokyo that thousands of their captured soldiers were being fed and housed in America, both governments scoffed. It sounded impossible. The Axis had built its empire on belief in moral superiority. Compassion from enemies did not fit the equation. Back home, Americans rationed sugar, coffee, meat, and gasoline, limiting families to ounces per week. That contrast, the sight of enemy prisoners eating full meals while civilians counted coupons, would soon ignite debate across small-town newspapers. Yet the Army's orders were explicit. War Department Technical Manual number 19500 stated, "All prisoners of war will receive the same rations as base troops of the United States Army." The reasoning was pragmatic as much as ethical. A well-fed prisoner caused fewer problems, worked efficiently, and provided propaganda proof of Western civilization's supremacy. To make this policy real, an entire domestic network emerged almost overnight. By 1943, engineers and civilian contractors had built 511 main camps connected to more than 900 satellite work sites, from Texas cotton fields to Wisconsin forests. Each camp included barracks, kitchens, hospitals, and recreation halls, all standardized by Army Corps of Engineers blueprints. Roughly 1,000 men from the U.S. Quartermaster Corps managed food supply alone. Every week, trains rolled from regional depots loaded with flour, milk powder, and tins of meat, destined for people still officially labeled the enemy. For the prisoners stepping down from train cars, disbelief defined their first days. Most came from units hollowed by hunger, many under 120 pounds with skin cracked from desert sun. Yet within weeks they began regaining weight documented carefully by camp surgeons. Inspections recorded average rations of 3,500 calories per day, identical to an American GI's intake. The menu rotated through stews, cabbage, potatoes, bread, and occasional fruit. Resource officers called it balanced morality. German cooks under U.S. supervision prepared meals inside spotless mess halls lined with long wooden tables. Even coffee, rationed on the home front, steamrolled freely over every breakfast. The War Department expected order, and food became the instrument. Cooperative prisoners received extra fruit or longer recreation. Troublemakers peeled potatoes. Hunger as punishment was forbidden. On Sundays, chaplains served services followed by what one ordnance captain called the quietest lunch hour ever recorded in wartime. This architecture of decency did not emerge without friction. From newspapers in Iowa to telegrams on Capitol Hill, citizens wrote furious letters. My sons risk their lives and the Nazis dine on steak. Congress demanded explanations. The Army responded with arithmetic and conscience. Feeding 430,000 prisoners consumed less than 1% of all rations allotted to U.S. forces abroad. Our strength, one general argued, is shown best when we restrain it. Even so, rumors persisted that German officers ate canned peaches while civilians settled for corn syrup, that the camp smelled of butter when city markets had none. Reality was more ordinary. Efficient nutrition, not luxury. But its symbolism mattered. America had chosen to win the moral argument through menu planning. The policy carried further purpose than anyone outside the Pentagon realized. Each boiled potato, each loaf, reinforced the story Washington hoped to tell the world. That democracy could afford compassion without fear. Over time, both captors and captives would learn that such generosity held consequences far beyond the fence lines. Feeding the enemy required an invisible army of its own. Behind every neatly served plate in a prisoner camp stood an interlocking network of civilian farmers, army inspectors, railroad men, and administrative clerks, the unseen front line of moral logistics. From the first trainloads of captured Germans in 1943 to the last repatriation convoys of 1946, the operation functioned with the same mechanical precision as any combat campaign. Responsibility began with the office of the Quartermaster General in Washington, which issued ration standards for prisoners of war. Each component was precisely weighed: 14 ounces of bread per day, 5 ounces of meat, 2 ounces of sugar, and fixed allotments of vegetables and fat. Field kitchens cooked by recipe, not improvisation. Camp cooks, often prisoners themselves under American supervision, signed forms confirming quantities received. Even salt and coffee substitutes required written inventory. The rationale was twofold: discipline for the captives and accountability for the guards. Abuse or hoarding would not simply offend conscience. It would violate regulation. Supply came largely from U.S. farms operating under wartime contract. Rows of wheat in Kansas, hog farms in Iowa, and dairy co-ops in Wisconsin produced the literal currency of Allied ethics. Train cars labeled for PWUs only ran on schedules parallel to troop transports. At regional depots in places like Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, or Fort Sam Houston, Texas, uniformed women of the Women's Army Corps managed food accounting ledgers by typewriter, each keystroke turning humanitarian policy into bureaucracy. Every shipment carried not just calories but reputation, proof that the United States kept its word even when no one demanded witness. Red Cross teams inspected camps every few months, documenting temperature of kitchens, cleanliness of mess halls, and portion sizes. Their reports consistently noted compliance and occasional excess. A 1944 visit to Camp Concordia, Kansas recorded, "Meal largely satisfactory. Prisoners express appreciation. Coffee of unusually good quality." In Washington, these findings became quiet propaganda. Copies were forwarded to Allied embassies and journalists, demonstrating the difference between democratic and fascist warfare. Despite its success, the policy collided repeatedly with home front hardship. Rationing books reminded Americans that generosity was being extended to those who once bombed their allies. Editorial cartoons mocked fat Nazis and chubby Italians behind fences. Congressman Lyle Boren of Oklahoma demanded an investigation, arguing that underfed farm families were shipping their best produce to prisoners. The Army invited him to visit an actual camp. After lunching beside POWs on identical meals, he admitted in congressional record, "Fairness does not starve patriotism. It disciplines it." Across Atlantic battlefields, contrasting realities deepened the argument. Reports of American prisoners starving in German and Japanese custody reached newspapers monthly. Survivors of camps such as Cabanatuan or Stalag 17 described bowls of watery turnip soup, beatings, and film propaganda portraying American weakness. In response, War Department spokesmen insisted, "We will not imitate barbarism." Their logic was strategic as much as idealistic. If the enemy saw that captured soldiers in America lived decently, they might reciprocate. Evidence later proved the assumption only half right. German fronts largely followed convention. Japan did not. But the gesture fortified America's moral armor before the eyes of neutral nations. Inside the perimeter, food shaped hierarchy. German officers dined together but shared kitchens with enlisted men. Italians volunteered for American cook duty to learn recipes they would take home. Even the few Japanese captives documented during 1944 found themselves anomalies, objects of curiosity more than contempt. Cultural misunderstandings became daily negotiation: rice versus bread, pork forbidden for Muslim laborers from North Africa, lentils appropriated wherever they fit. Yet the rhythm persisted. 3 meals daily for everyone. An accounting so relentless it sometimes felt more doctrine than diet. The Americans understood food as leverage, the psychological front no weapon could breach. Guards reported measurable calm after well-cooked dinners. Escape attempts dropped dramatically. "Keep them busy and keep them fed," wrote one major to his colonel in 1945, and they behave better than recruits. By war's end, behavior reports confirmed it. 93% of Axis prisoners exhibited orderly conduct. In camp slang, the kitchen had beaten ideology, but beneath that triumph lay an uncomfortable irony. Starving Europe watched from across the Atlantic while its conquerors gained weight behind American fences. Foreign correspondents arriving after the German surrender would photograph well-fed POWs preparing for repatriation, contrasting their faces with the hollow eyes of displaced civilians outside. These images sparked renewed argument. Had America gone too far? Had mercy become extravagance? That question led to the eventful year of 1944, when public scrutiny peaked and military virtue turned headline, the moment Washington had to justify, before both citizens and allies, why decency toward captives defined the United States as sharply as any battlefield victory. Each mealtime in a U.S. POW camp was a miniature campaign, planned with the precision of an artillery schedule. From the farm to the spoon, every step had a timetable and a signature. Trucks arrived before dawn loaded with flour, milk, ration tins, and coffee beans, all stamped U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. At Camp Dermot in Arkansas alone, cooks prepared nearly 12,000 meals per day. Steam rolled out of galley roofs as field kitchens functioned like factories. Prep lines of German prisoner cooks under American sergeant supervisors peeling potatoes, stirring stews, kneading bread. Those kitchens turned moral obligation into procedure. Recipes were posted in both English and German. Thermometers hung from rafters to prove compliance to inspectors. Menus varied by climate and availability: okra in the South, apples in Wisconsin, cornmeal in Kansas. But nutritional totals matched U.S. Army standards. Roughly 3,500 calories with 20% protein and 12% fat. Waste was weighed. Leftovers became pig feed for nearby farms, closing a virtuous circle of wartime efficiency. What seemed like generosity was, in practice, administrative mastery. American logisticians took pride in it. Feeding 430,000 prisoners daily demanded nearly 1,800 tons of food, the same as supplying an entire field army. Yet trains ran on time, depots stayed stocked, and not one official Red Cross report recorded hunger in U.S. camps. Measured in calories instead of shells, it was another theater where production won the war. The same system that could deliver millions of artillery rounds to Normandy could also deliver warm bread to men behind wire. Efficiency had become ethics. America's choice to feed its enemies well wasn't sentimentality. It was strategic morality. The White House and War Department believed global leadership required moral credibility. President Roosevelt's directive was explicit. Treatment of prisoners must testify to our civilization. If an ideology proclaiming racial superiority governed the Axis, then humane order would be democracy's counterclaim. Washington intended each balanced meal as a political message to the world: and to occupied peoples listening by rumor. In the democracy of the kitchen, even enemies could eat. There was also an economic rationale. Healthy prisoners could work. By 1944, U.S. labor shortages threatened harvests and lumber mills as millions of Americans served overseas. POWs became substitute manpower under the classification of working prisoners. They picked cotton in Texas, baled hay in Nebraska, cut pulpwood in Minnesota, and earned small wages credited to camp accounts. Feeding them properly kept productivity high and discipline simple. In the paradox many observers missed, nourishment served both humanity and necessity. Still, moral dimension remained undeniable. When American chaplains visited camps, they found religious services attended eagerly even by atheists, the act of prayer itself signifying safety unimaginable elsewhere. Cooks who once feared poison now asked for recipes. An Indiana commandant summed up the moral calculus in a report to Washington. "We break their hate by full stomachs faster than by lectures." Food replaced sermons. Every loaf baked inside the wire echoed the same principle the United States was fighting to defend outside of it. That power without cruelty defined civilization. Yet outside those fences, generosity boiled controversy. American housewives counting ration coupons read newspaper features about POWs eating bacon on Sundays. Letters poured into Senate offices accusing the army of pampering Nazis, while families scraped for butter. A popular catchphrase appeared in small-town editorials. More meat for Hitler's heirs than for ours. Public outrage forced the War Department into an awkward public relations campaign explaining that POW food wasn't improved. It was standardized. Army pamphlets printed calorie charts comparing American soldiers, prisoners, and civilians to prove equality. Few minds were changed. For families who had lost sons in Europe, kindness toward their killers stung. Window displays of captured flags lived beside ration posters reading, "Do with less so they'll have enough." Yet the moral divide also fascinated many Americans. Churches organized discussions on Christian duty. Newspapers reprinted the Geneva Convention in full. The argument brought abstract ethics into kitchen debates. Gradually, outrage cooled as another truth became clear. Prisoners paid rent on their morality through work. They filled labor shortages, stabilizing prices, and helping locals harvest crops. By war's end, some families who once opposed feeding POWs invited them to post-war reunions, thanking them for keeping farms alive. The controversy had revealed something profound. Even in total war, Americans assumed morality required transparency. Citizens could question their government precisely because they already trusted it, not to descend into cruelty. Feeding the enemy thus became not just policy, but public examination, a national self-portrait drawn in food ledgers and mess hall menus. Together, these angles, mechanical precision, moral assertion, and democratic friction, formed the foundation of America's most paradoxical wartime success. An army proving its humanity with a knife, fork, and accountability form. The next set of angles would bring that paradox inside the fences through the eyes of the very men who tasted it. For captured German soldiers, arrival in the United States felt like transportation to another planet. Most came from ruined deserts or the battlefields of Italy, where hunger marched beside them. They had been told by propaganda that Americans were barbarians, cowards who killed prisoners or starved them for sport. Yet camp life presented scenes of order and abundance. Barracks issued clean uniforms, blankets, and daily bread still warm when carried from the ovens. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, a Red Cross inspector noted that the Germans consumed more calories than civilians in Berlin. A former Africa Corps corporal described breakfast rations with astonishment. "Coffee, oatmeal, butter, and jam. We thought it a trick." Within weeks, skepticism gave way to grudging admiration. Many kept diaries filled not with ideology but recipes, sketches of food and words like Apfelkuchen and reunion. As the war dragged on, some volunteered for agricultural work to earn extra sugar or fruit. Officers enforced camp discipline using the promise of good meals rather than the threat of punishment. The abundance chipped away at indoctrination faster than any lecture could. Captured propaganda officers once tasked with spreading Nazi ideals began attending English classes, reasoning that a nation capable of such sustenance could not be as weak as they'd been taught. By 1945, Interrogators reported that cooperation from German prisoners reached unprecedented levels, owed partly to what one sergeant called converts by cuisine. To Washington, these journals and testimonies were quiet victories. Feeding the enemy had done what bombs could not. It reopened the German idea of America. If German prisoners respected America's efficiency, Italian POWs adored its informality. After Italy's capitulation in 1943, roughly 50,000 Italian soldiers in U.S. custody signed loyalty, oaths declaring opposition to the Axis, and were redesignated Italian service units. They wore distinctive patches, U.S. uniforms over Italian hearts, and worked freely in depots, hospitals, and farms. Their rations equaled those of their American counterparts, complete with limited wine allowances when available. Camp Atterbury in Indiana reflected the transformation. Italian bands played opera during lunch. Kitchens experimented with Mediterranean dishes using army rations, spaghetti with canned tomatoes, stewed beef seasoned with borrowed basil from local gardens. American cooks watched curiously, then joined in. Food blurred language. Evenings ended with guitar and accordion melodies crossing the fence line. By 1944, the War Department cited the Italian camps as proof that humane treatment converted enemies into allies. Their cooperation shortened supply shortages and aided morale. In one New Jersey depot, Italian bakers produced thousands of loaves daily for shipment to nearby German camps. Letters home from U.S. Guards described their captives as the happiest soldiers in America. The policy's ripple effect was diplomatic. When Italy formally switched sides, these prisoners became the nucleus of goodwill for post-war partnership. The Italian experience validated the experiment. Kindness was not weakness. It was infrastructure, and shared meals were its architecture. In the Pacific, the story diverged. Japanese culture viewed surrender as spiritual death. Out of millions of imperial troops, barely 10,000 survived capture by war's end, a fraction compared to the European front. Those who reached American hands arrived skeletal and silent, prepared for execution that never came. Japanese POW facilities were few and heavily guarded until trust could be established. The same U.S. Army system fed them precisely according to regulation, but emotional impact ran deeper. Doctors treating emaciated captives documented the moment of discovery as transformative. At Camp McCoy, a medic wrote, "When they tasted milk for the first time, some trembled as if remembering humanity." American officers quickly realized food itself provided psychological medicine. Rice was substituted for bread when possible, soybeans for lentils. Prisoners recovering their strength learned basic English words: bread, water, peace. For many, nutrition marked their first experience of equality with foreigners. Compared to European camps, the Japanese compounds remained quiet, even monastic. Shame suppressed conversation, yet gratitude appeared in gestures. Impeccably cleaned bowls returned after each meal, polite bows toward cooks. By 1946, during repatriation interviews, several former Japanese prisoners credited their survival to Americans, who fed us against dishonor. Such statements later influenced early drafts of U.S. occupation policy emphasizing dignity through supply, the same principle scaled nationally in the food relief programs that rebuilt post-war Japan. The triangle of experiences, German pragmatism, Italian warmth, Japanese reconciliation, proved the universality of one truth: sustenance could dismantle ideology faster than interrogation. From here, the story turns outward, toward the moment America's quiet generosity became public controversy, when congressional visitors, Red Cross inspectors, and the global press encountered the paradox that feeding the enemy had become one of democracy's loudest victories. The year 1944 brought Allied victories abroad and domestic confusion at home. Newspapers printed photographs that startled readers. Neat rows of German prisoners smiling weakly beside steaming trays of food, camp officers inspecting spotless kitchens, even USO performers visiting to play music inside wire fences. The images looked orderly, almost wholesome, but beneath them brewed an uncomfortable question. Americans were still rationing between gratitude and grief. Every new headline about pampered Nazis felt like a moral bruise. Congress decided to see for itself. That spring, the War Department invited senators, reporters, and Red Cross representatives to inspect representative camps. What they found became legend. At Camp Atterbury in Indiana, powdered milk machines hummed beside stoves where German bakers rolled dough for hundreds of loaves. Inspectors toured dining halls hung with hand-painted menus listing stews and pudding. Each utensil gleamed under California-made fluorescent strips, technology many American schools still lacked. Behind one serving line, an Iowa senator lifted a spoon, tasted the thick meat gravy, and turned to General Brehen Somervell, Chief of Army Services of Supply. "I couldn't eat better in Washington." Somervell's reply became famous. "You couldn't eat more honestly either." Magazines like Life and the Saturday Evening post-published feature spreads portraying civility in captivity. Articles praised the miracle of American efficiency, noting that Red Cross inspections consistently rated U.S. POW rations highest among all belligerents. For many readers, however, the photograph of laughing German prisoners ladling potatoes under an American flag struck too bright a note. Letters flooded editorial offices demanding parity, with "Soldiers' families still queuing with ration" coupons. The War Department countered by inviting the press to contrast conditions with German camps uncovered during the eastward Allied drive. Images from Stalag 7A in Moosburg, diseased Allied prisoners thin as fence posts, ran beside those of healthy Axis captives on U.S. soil. The juxtaposition silenced accusations faster than any speech. Radio news correspondents reminded listeners, "Humanity here repays cruelty there." For the first time in wartime memory, decency became propaganda, yet debate sharpened the experiment's meaning. Inside the camps, inspections now intensified. Menus rotated weekly. Precise calorie counts were posted publicly on notice boards in both German and English. Nutritional charts showed prisoners' average weight gains between 1943 and 1944, 10 to 15 pounds per man. Food had turned measurable. Morality now had statistics. The logical conclusion followed. If rations could win loyalty, could they also reshape nations? Army psychologists assigned to prisoner education centers reported that satisfied men attended English classes and anti-Nazification lectures voluntarily. Officers noted it with wary pride. "Feed them, then teach them," one memo summarized. Hungry stomachs learn nothing. Meanwhile, in Europe, word seeped back through captured mail and Red Cross exchanges. Returning wounded German soldiers whispered in disbelief that their comrades in America lived comfortably and sent money home from farm work. Rumors reached Berlin and stirred outrage within the propaganda ministry. Goebbels personally ordered new broadcasts warning that American mercy is a lie, but intercepted radio transcripts revealed listeners doubting the message. By the time the German people learned the truth, belief in totalitarian discipline was already eroding, undermined by the quiet credibility of a full plate. By late 1944, the humanitarian gamble had become self-sustaining policy. America had transformed food into diplomacy, nourishment into narrative. What had begun as bureaucratic compliance with the Geneva Convention now stood as living testimony that democracy's strength lay not in starvation or fear, but in restraint backed by unassailable abundance. That revelation would echo even louder after the guns fell silent, when captured men, repatriated across a defeated world, carried memories of full meals and unarmed guards back to lands hollowed by hunger. The final months of 1945 turned America's kitchens into front lines of persuasion. Axis armies were collapsing, yet the power of food had not finished fighting. Across Germany, refugees wandered through skeletal cities while word spread that their captured sons overseas had come home heavier than they left. At ports from Boston to New York, steamer gangways echoed with disbelief. POWs stepping off ships in pressed uniforms, hair combed, cheeks full. Medical inspectors recorded average weight gains of 12 pounds. Hospital wards, expecting emaciated survivors, instead received men robust enough to carry their own duffels. Reporters covering the repatriations called it the paradox of America's gentlest victory. In interviews published in Der Spiegel years later, repatriated soldiers recalled the same sensory shock: bread that never ran out, guards who offered second helpings, meals served even after Germany's surrender. A former sergeant of the 352nd Infantry admitted, We learned that a country able to feed its enemy will never go hungry in spirit. That comment, reprinted widely, captured the emotional pivot Washington had aimed for. The food policy was no longer simply an internal standard. It had become living diplomacy, a moral export more convincing than leaflets. Meanwhile, Japanese POWs, far fewer in number but scarred by another culture's code, experienced revelation in slower motion. On returning home, they recounted tales of kindness that defied every wartime rumor. In towns still rationing rice, talk of Americans serving white bread and soup to captives spread amazement and anger at Japan's own military elite. Occupation officials from General MacArthur's headquarters noticed this shift, noting that accounts from well-treated ex-prisoners aided the acceptance of reform. Once again, sustenance turned psychological, the soft power of nourishment rebuilding the notion of decency itself. Back in the United States, Congress reviewed final camp budgets. The numbers amazed even the accountants. Less than 1% of military expenditure had funded the entire POW program. 3 meals a day for 430,000. Prisoners had cost barely the price of a single heavy bomber squadron and delivered immeasurable propaganda return. U.S. Army. Reports cataloged morale superiority as a measurable commodity, concluding that humane treatment of prisoners stood beside atomic power and industrial production as proof of unmatched national capacity. Not everyone celebrated. In war-weary communities, memories lingered of lean years and ration stamps fading under kitchen lights. Some families quietly resented that mercy had been extended to enemies when compassion for minorities or the poor at home remained inconsistent. America's conscience was still conflicted, but conflict was itself evidence of democratic health. The argument could exist without fear. Freedom, like food supply, was sustainable only by surplus. By 1946, most camps had closed, their barracks sold to farmers or repurposed as post-war housing. But traces of the Grand Kitchen campaign remained: cement foundations, rusted stove hoods, a handful of German and Italian recipes absorbed into Midwestern cookbooks. More telling was the human residue. Thousands of former POWs wrote back to their former guards, exchanging letters that began with rations and grew into friendships. Some emigrated later, seeking the land that fed us. For historians compiling the War Department's final report on enemy prisoners, one conclusion summarized 3 years of effort. American abundance expressed devotion to ideals impossible to counterfeit. Feeding the enemy had been less a gesture of charity than a declaration of identity. It told the world what America claimed to be, and briefly, through the simplest human act, it made that claim undeniable. From the smoke of battle rose a quiet truth that no victory parade could match. The real power of a wealthy nation was not in how many it killed, but in how many it had the discipline to keep alive. That realization marked the turning point when feeding became statement, an edible treaty that preceded peace itself. After the final prison ships sailed, the U.S. Army's cooks returned to civilian life, their ladles set down beside medals and ration cards. They had served in a front line without atrocity, proving that civilization's strongest recipe was restraint. How those choices shaped both occupation policy and the emerging global reputation of the United States forms the heart of the aftermath that followed. By the time the last barbed wire gates closed and the final trains carried prisoners east to awaiting ships, America's experiment in decency had become one of the most successful mass custody programs in modern history. Between 1942 and 1946, not one major riot, famine, or epidemic occurred inside a U.S. POW camp. The Red Cross called the record unparalleled in scope and humanity. Europe, however, lay in ruins. When the German prisoners reached home, they stepped into a different world. Cities hollowed by bombing, food supply near collapse, families surviving on beets and dry bread. Many arrived healthier than their relatives. British officers at repatriation depots in Hamburg joked grimly that the best-fed Germans in Europe came from Kansas. What began as political embarrassment slowly turned symbolic, evidence that the democratic enemy had preserved what Nazism devoured: the ordinary dignity of eating. Surveys commissioned by the Allied Control Council in 1946 found striking results. Within a year of repatriation, more than 2/3 of former POWs expressed positive views toward the United States. Sociologists later noted that their testimonies, filled with details about mess hall cleanliness, the taste of cornbread, and the absence of brutality, formed one of the earliest cultural bridges between the occupied nation and its occupier. When the Marshall Plan began 2 years later, its architects quoted those same reports. The will to rebuild is sustained by the experience of plenty, once even as prisoners. Italian returnees told a similar story. For many, captivity had become apprenticeship. They had learned American agricultural routines, hygiene standards, and large-scale catering methods then unknown in Europe. In rural Tuscany and Lombardy, post-war cooperatives modeled their grain storage and communal kitchens after camp layouts remembered from Atterbury or Fort Sheridan. A few veterans even opened bakeries named America, advertising themselves as students of U.S. Army bread. The reaction in Japan proved quieter but profound. Its few surviving prisoners, stigmatized at home for surrendering, nonetheless described humane treatment amid abundance. Occupation officials collected their statements to counter extremist propaganda. Their memories became lessons. Food is dignity, not indulgence. The policy that had once merely contrasted enemies now began shaping Reconstruction philosophy. General Douglas MacArthur's administration placed feeding the population at the center of reform, arguing that democracy began with a full stomach. Behind that strategy echoed faintly the same Geneva-bound logic the War Department had practiced in its camps. Feed first, govern after. In the United States, the story found delayed appreciation. Returning GIs from Europe and the Pacific came home hungry for jobs, not ethics. Yet gradually, local papers began publishing reunion anecdotes. German ex-prisoners wrote thank-you notes to American farmers' wives. A Wisconsin family received hand-woven gloves from a former enemy who wrote, "You fed me like a man when I thought I was no longer one." Such letters decorated mantelpieces beside bronze stars. Americans who had once resented stakes for Nazis realized the gesture had bought something money could not: credibility. Time magazine later summarized it perfectly. "We proved that goodness can be orderly." At military academies, the POW feeding program became case study rather than footnote. Instructors explained that every loaf baked under rationing conditions had required calculation of calories, rail capacity, and moral calculus. Young officers were taught that warfare was no longer total when conscience survived logistics. Feeding had become tactic. Now, with victory secure and compassion quantified, the moral question turned forward. Could the same discipline guide peace? The next stage of the story, the political and cultural legacy of this unheralded war of food, would suggest that the spoon wielded, in the end, as much power as the gun. In the decades that followed, historians and policymakers alike returned again and again to the ethics of plenty, born within those wartime fences. Its results had traveled farther than the prisoners themselves. Feeding the enemy had rewritten international expectations, permanently affecting how civilized nations managed captivity, recovery, and even diplomacy. When the United Nations drafted the 1949 Geneva Conventions, large sections dealing with prisoner welfare echoed wording straight from U.S. Army manuals of 1943. Articles mandating equal rations, medical inspection, and access to the Red Cross were no longer theoretical. They had already been field-tested across America's heartland. Foreign delegates whose countries had learned the hard way endorsed the clauses without debate. The precedent stood. Food was not benevolence. It was law. During the Cold War, those same practices became a silent weapon. Photographs of clean POW camps from the 1940s resurfaced in propaganda leaflets dropped over Korea and Vietnam, evidence that Americans treated foes fairly. While adversaries boasted ideology, Washington boasted cinnamon rolls and sanitation. The message remained potent. A system strong enough to feed enemies would never collapse under scarcity. Even critics grudgingly admitted that humanitarian supply chains had become part of national defense. At home, the cultural footprint persisted in quieter ways. Recipes carried from camps, German rye bread, Italian pasta variations, entered American cookbooks through captured chefs turned immigrants. Former guards and former prisoners met at reunions through the 1960s, standing beside barbecues where language blended the way flour once had in shared kitchens. Some marriages crossed the old divide. Small towns in Iowa and Nebraska proudly traced new family trees back to the year the Germans worked our fields. In universities, sociologists studied the camps as laboratories of democracy under stress. They found that neither charity nor fear sustained order. Procedural fairness did. When every prisoner received identical portions without favoritism, gratitude replaced resentment. What appeared as luxury through barbed wire was in fact predictability, and predictability bred peace. Decades later, military academies crystallized the insight into doctrine. Consistency is the first kindness in command. Meanwhile, veterans who had once wheeled food carts instead of gun carriages carried those lessons into the emerging humanitarian landscape. They staffed UN relief efforts, designed Marshall Plan kitchens, and advised the new agency UNICEF. To them, feeding wasn't metaphor. It was memory. They had seen ideology soften over warm bread. By the early 1970s, the story faded behind brighter spectacles of post-war progress. But in archival photographs, American farm girls serving stew to German working parties, Italian singers performing near canteens, Japanese detainees bowing over rice, the moral legacy glowed like quiet film grain. Every frame whispered the same unexpected thesis, that generosity enforced by discipline can outlast hatred enforced by fear. For the United States, the program's success became part of its post-war self-image, joining the Marshall Plan and the Berlin Airlift as proof that abundance could triumph without arrogance. Feeding those once sworn to destroy America had transformed the nation's moral vocabulary, from conquest to stewardship. Few citizens remembered the daily logistics, the rail cars, the ration charts, but they inherited the reputation they built. Around the world, America became not only the arsenal of democracy, but its pantry. That dual identity carried costs and responsibilities still measured today. Whenever disaster strikes and cargo planes drop packages marked from the people of the United States, they echo decisions made a generation earlier, decisions forged in places like Fort Robinson and Camp Atterbury, where mercy had been weighed in ounces and delivered precisely on schedule. The guns that won the war grew silent long ago. The kitchens that fed the peace never stopped. Their story draws to its quiet conclusion in reflection, a question not merely of history, but of who we become when power and principle share the same table. Beneath the noise of a world at war, the simple rhythm of utensils against metal trays carried a different kind of victory. America's decision to feed its enemies was not an act of charity born from softness. It was strategy written in conscience. Where bombs spoke in minutes, meals spoke in generations. Every bowl of stew and loaf of bread, served behind barbed wire, became a quiet declaration of what the United States claimed: to be a nation powerful, enough to fight evil and restrained enough to show mercy. Other countries produced weapons faster. None produced morality with such precision. Within those ordered kitchens, the American experiment was put to its hardest test. Can a free people treat the defeated as human and still remain secure? The answer rose each morning with steam from camp chimneys. The food did more than keep men alive. It dismantled hatred molecule by molecule until former enemies learned a new word for strength. Bread replaced bullets as diplomacy, and discipline replaced vengeance as doctrine. When those prisoners went home, they carried the taste of liberty in their memory: flour, coffee, and fairness. History often crowns victors for destruction, yet here the triumph lay in preservation. The same factories that forged tanks forged ovens. The same resolve that leveled armies filled plates. Beneath the flags and statistics, this was the war's quiet moral frontier, a proof that civilization endures where decency is organized. Long after the gunfire faded, the story of how America fed its enemies continues to echo, reminding us that the real measure of a nation is not only how fiercely it defends itself, but how honorably it treats those who cannot.